I never imagined my marriage would end the way it did, publicly, painfully, and with a betrayal that still burns whenever I think about it. My name is Elena. I'm 36 years old, and for years I convinced myself that silence was safer than facing the truth. But silence doesn't save you, it drowns you. And the night of my husband's work party, I finally learned just how deep that silence had buried me. When I first met Mark, he was everything I thought I wanted. Ambitious, charming, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone turn their heads. I was quieter, more introverted. I liked books, slow evenings, and spaces where I didn't have to perform. We were different, but I thought those differences would balance us. And in the early years, maybe they did. But somewhere along the way, we stopped being a couple and became two people simply existing in the same house. He filled his time with late nights at the office, endless meetings, business trips that stretched longer than they should. I filled mine with excuses, convincing myself that marriage was supposed to feel like this, that distance was just another word for routine. So when Mark insisted that I join him at his company's annual party, I let myself believe it was a sign. Maybe he wanted me in his world again. Maybe this was his way of pulling me closer. I spent hours getting ready, slipping into a dress that hugged me just right, hoping he would notice. He didn't. Not a word, not even a glance of appreciation. Still, I smiled, told myself it was fine, and followed him into a glittering hall full of powerful people who seemed more like his family than I ever did. At first, it wasn't terrible. I shook hands, sipped wine, answered polite questions about who I was. Some of his colleagues seemed genuinely curious, as if I were a myth finally stepping into the light. I caught Mark looking at me once or twice, and for a fleeting moment I thought maybe he was proud to have me there. Maybe we could still find our way back to each other. Then the music shifted. The lights dimmed, couples began to drift to the dance floor, and that's when it happened. A man I barely knew, a colleague of Mark's named Wilson, walked straight past my husband and held out his hand to me. He didn't even acknowledge Mark. He looked at me with the kind of confidence that suggested he already knew the answer. My heart froze. I waited for Mark to step in, to put his arm around me, to tell this man I was his wife. But Mark said nothing. He just smirked as if this was all some amusing game. I wanted to refuse, but before I could, Wilson leaned closer, his voice dripping with arrogance. And Mark? He just sat there sipping his drink. So I hesitated, and in that hesitation, everything shattered. I let Wilson pull me toward the dance floor. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't fun. His hand pressed too low on my back. His eyes lingered too long, and every move screamed ownership. But the worst part wasn't Wilson's touch, it was Mark's indifference. My husband watched as if I were nothing more than entertainment. When the song ended and I pulled away, humiliated, he didn't defend me. He didn't even ask if I was okay. Instead, in the car later that night, he turned the blame on me. He told me I embarrassed him. He told me I was paranoid, dramatic, insecure. That was the moment I realized I wasn't his wife anymore, I was his scapegoat. I could have walked away then. Maybe I should have. But betrayal doesn't just wound, it awakens. Something inside me hardened that night. If Mark thought he could sit back and watch me be humiliated, if Wilson thought he could treat me like property, then both of them were about to learn who I truly was. Because I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The morning after that party, I stood in the kitchen staring at my reflection in the black surface of my coffee. My face looked hollow, older, as if one night had aged me years. Mark came downstairs, tie already knotted, phone glued to his hand. He didn't say good morning. He didn't say anything at all. He just grabbed his briefcase and walked out the door. The click of that latch was like a final verdict. Whatever was left between us had died the night before. But what he didn't know was that his silence had lit a fire inside me. I started small. Wilson wasn't just a man who had embarrassed me. He was known in that office, always surrounded by whispers. I remembered the way some of the younger women at the party avoided his eyes, the way one girl flinched when he brushed too close. I knew that look. I had felt it myself. So I began asking quiet questions, reaching out to anyone who might know more. At first, no one wanted to talk. Fear has a way of stitching lips shut. But slowly, carefully, women began to open up. One told me about late-night mentorship meetings that always ended with him cornering her against a desk. Another admitted she left the company after her complaint disappeared into HR's black hole. And there were other stories layered on top of one another, painting Wilson not as a one-time offender, but as a predator, hidden in plain sight. The more I heard, the angrier I became, not just at him, but at Mark. Because my husband wasn't ignorant. He knew. He had to know. You don't spend a decade in the same office without hearing those whispers. And yet when Wilson laid his hands on me, Mark didn't defend me. He smirked. He enjoyed the show. That realization cut deeper than anything Wilson had done. I kept notes, dates, names, details. I spoke with a woman who had quietly gathered her own evidence years earlier, but never had the courage to take it further. She handed me a folder, trembling, and whispered, "If you do this, do it for all of us." At home, Mark grew more distant. His phone buzzed constantly with messages he refused to explain. He spent entire weekends working, leaving me alone in a house that felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. Sometimes I wondered if he was with someone else. Sometimes I didn't even care. Because by then my focus wasn't on saving our marriage. It was on burning down the facade that kept men like Wilson untouchable and exposing the husband who had let him thrive. Mark's mother called me one afternoon, her voice brittle. "He's not his father," she said abruptly. "But he learned the same tricks. Pretending not to see is easier than standing up. That's how they all survive in that circle." Her words shook me, long-buried secrets rising like ghosts. Suddenly, Mark's indifference made sense. This wasn't new, it was inherited. Generational silence passed down like a family heirloom. And I was expected to keep playing my part, smiling, staying quiet, swallowing humiliation to preserve appearances. But I couldn't, not anymore. So I made a choice. I contacted a lawyer, one who specialized in corporate misconduct. I sent anonymous packages to the board of directors and to a journalist known for refusing to be silenced. Inside were the stories I'd gathered, the evidence, the testimonies of women who had been ignored for years. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. And then I waited. The first tremor shook their world within a week. A headline appeared online: "Allegations of misconduct surface at prestigious firm." Wilson's name wasn't printed yet, but I recognized the phrasing, the careful way journalists hint at storms before the thunder rolls in. At home, Mark slammed his phone on the counter, muttering about rumors and baseless claims. His jaw was tight, his eyes flashing with something between fear and anger. He didn't notice the way my hands stilled over the dishes, the way I studied him like a puzzle, finally revealing its pieces. The calls started soon after. Late-night whispers from his colleagues' strategy sessions to decide how much they could bury and how much they had to sacrifice. I pretended not to listen, but every word etched itself into me. They weren't worried about the women. They weren't worried about truth. They were worried about optics, about stock prices, about who would take the fall so the rest could stay clean. And then the storm broke. Wilson's name was everywhere. Articles poured out, each one sharper than the last, filled with testimony after testimony. Women who had once been silenced were now a chorus, their voices undeniable. Photos of him at corporate events were plastered beside the words "abuse of power." The man who had pressed his hand into my back on the dance floor was now painted for what he truly was: a predator. Mark grew frantic. He paced the living room, phone glued to his ear, whispering about damage control. One night he looked at me, his face pale, and said, "They're coming after me next." For a moment I almost pitied him. Almost. Because I knew he was right. I had included his name in those packages, not as a perpetrator, but as a protector. Screenshots of emails he ignored, reports he brushed aside, complaints he labeled unsubstantiated. I showed the pattern, not just what Wilson had done, but how men like Mark had enabled it with their silence. The board demanded explanations. HR went into overdrive. And Mark, my husband, the man who once promised to shield me from the world, was suddenly scrambling to shield himself. One night, after another long phone call, he dropped into a chair and buried his face in his hands. "They want me to resign," he whispered. His voice cracked, but I felt nothing. Not rage, not triumph, just emptiness. He had chosen his side long ago, and it wasn't mine. What cut deepest wasn't his downfall, it was his confession that followed. His voice was raw when he said it. I knew. I always knew what Wilson was, I just didn't want to get involved. That was it. The truth I had waited for. He knew, and every time he dismissed me, every time he told me I was overreacting, he was lying not to protect me, but to protect himself. Something inside me settled that night. The grief, the anger, the humiliation, it all crystallized into clarity. I couldn't save this marriage. I couldn't save a man who had built his life on silence, but I could save myself. So I started planning my exit. I packed quietly, carefully, as if each folded shirt and zipped suitcase were pieces of my dignity being gathered back into my own hands. Mark didn't notice at first. He was too consumed with the fallout emergency meetings, damage control calls, whispers of investigations closing in. His phone was never silent, but his eyes no longer held the sharpness of control. He looked like a man drowning, and for the first time I didn't feel compelled to save him. The night before I left, he came home late, his tie askew, his face pale. He dropped his briefcase by the door and stared at me like I was a stranger. They're blaming me, he muttered. They're saying I let it happen, that I turned away. He searched my face, waiting for reassurance, waiting for me to tell him he was still the man I believed in. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I thought about that night at the party, about the way Wilson's hand pressed into my back and how Mark sat there smirking, letting it happen. About the women whose stories I had gathered who had been silenced by the very culture he helped maintain. And I realized he was right, they were blaming him. Because he was guilty. Not of Wilson's crimes, but of the silence that fed them. I left him a note on the counter the next morning. It was short, just a few lines scrawled on paper I had torn from my notebook. You lost me long before you lost your job. I won't be part of your silence anymore. I set my key beside it, picked up my bags, and walked out the door without looking back. Starting over wasn't easy. I was 36 raw, carrying wounds that didn't bleed, but still ached. Yet each step away from that house felt lighter. I rented a small apartment across town, filled it with plants, light, and colors that were mine alone. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's world, I was building my own. Meanwhile, the headlines kept coming. Wilson became a symbol of corporate corruption, his name dragged through every article about toxic workplaces. And Mark. He resigned quietly, his departure buried in a press release about organizational restructuring. He faded into the background, a man who once seemed untouchable, reduced to a footnote in someone else's scandal. Sometimes I hear whispers about him, that he tried to rebuild his career in smaller firms, that people don't trust him the way they once did. But those whispers no longer sting. They are not mine to carry. Because I rebuilt too. I found work that valued my voice, colleagues who saw me not as an accessory, but as a partner. I learned to trust my own instincts again, to listen when my gut told me something was wrong. And most of all, I learned that silence is never safety. It's a slow erasure, a suffocation disguised as peace. When I look back now, I don't see myself as the woman humiliated on the dance floor. I see the woman who refused to let that moment define her. The woman who turned betrayal into revelation, who chose herself over complicity, who broke a cycle of silence that had stretched across generations. And if you're listening to this, maybe you've been there too, swallowed by someone else's indifference, told you were dramatic when all you wanted was respect. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: don't stay quiet. Don't let anyone convince you that your pain is too small to matter. Your voice has power. Use it. If my story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. And leave me a comment. Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken, and what did it cost you? I want to hear your truth.